going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country.
President Trump speaking after stunning the world by removing Venezuela's president from power, but giving few details on what comes next. This is the Asia Trade. I'm Paul Allen in Sydney.
And I'm Avril Hong in Singapore as we look at the impact of Trump's audacious bid to reshape Latin America. Nicolas Maduro is now in custody in New York as an indicted prisoner, but his government remains in power in Venezuela amid confusion about what Trump means by running the country. Oil set to be in focus when trading begins in the next hour. We're seeing muted currency moves so far, while Bitcoin holds above $90,000. Plus, China joining some Latin American governments in condemning the unprecedented U.S. military intervention as a violation of international law.
You're watching a special extended edition of Asia Trade this morning as uncertainty looms over Venezuela. And Avril, you know, it's nearly 50 years to the day, in fact, that Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. That was way back January 1, 1976, and now on January 3, 2026. Nicolas Maduro snatched from his own house in that incredible raid over the weekend. More questions than answers at the moment. I mean, who will lead? It's going to be Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, running an interim administration for now. But how long is the U.S. going to be involved in, to use President Trump's words, running Venezuela? How do you even run a foreign country? And a lot of Maduro loyalists still in place there. Markets going to have their first chance to react today.
Questions as well on the legality of such a move by the Trump administration. And on top of that, we have been hearing from the Secretary of State in terms of him being the chief public voice on this incursion in Venezuela over the weekend. He has also been offering some sense of the U.S. strategy amid all this. Take a listen.
There's a quarantine right now in which sanctioned oil shipments, there's a boat, and that boat is under U.S. sanctions. We go get a court order, we will seize it. That remains in place. And that's a tremendous amount of leverage that will continue to be in place until we see changes that not just further the national interest of the United States, which is number one, but also that lead to a better future for the people of Venezuela.
Well, let's get to Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, who is at the White House, and Bloomberg Economics Latin America geoeconomics analyst and Argentina economist Jimena Zuniga, who joins us from Buenos Aires. Tyler, let's start with you. What's the reaction been on Capitol Hill to this, and what's going to happen next?
Yeah, hey, Paul. Well, you put it perfectly before. There are more questions than answers tonight here at the White House. Now, starting with your question on Capitol Hill, there has been a mixed response with many Republicans and hawks on the Hill coming out in favor of the administration's actions, while Democrats are trying to thread the needle between being opposed to how President Trump took this action, but in favor of the fact that Nicolas Maduro has now left the country. There's a few different ways that this could evolve on the Hill moving forward, but in the days ahead, we are expecting lawmakers to press the administration on the constitutional authority that they used in order to conduct this strike. When you ask officials here at the White House, they point you to two answers. One is that they often call this a trigger mission, meaning that a set of factors had to be in place in order for them to pull the trigger, and that they didn't feel that this was a mission that needed congressional approval because there was a large timeline under which that it could take place. The second is that we heard multiple times today from the Secretary of State Marco Rubio that this was the administration moving out a law enforcement function, and therefore that falls under more of the Department of Justice and their jurisdiction, which doesn't typically require a congressional notification. So something to clearly watch moving forward here, as we really have seen this White House expand the power of executive action so far under this administration.
Tyler, what do we know as well about the lack of this regime change for Venezuela and the U.S. approach amid all this?
Right. So, Avril, a U.S. official has confirmed that moving forward, the next steps include a coalition engaging diplomatically with those remaining in Venezuela's government, and that group will be led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio when it comes to the discussions. It has been confirmed, of course, by President Trump yesterday that Rubio was already in contact with Nicolas Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who has, of course, condemned the U.S. action. Still, officials have indicated that they feel Rodriguez is somebody that they could work with going forward and that they will monitor how she responds in the days ahead. This after President Trump had indicated during his press conference that he does not feel that Democratic opposition leader Maria Machado will be able to assume power. It does feel that the White House really does have this strong sense that it has the leverage here, with officials in the last few hours repointing to the fact that there is that continued embargo on Venezuelan oil and that the U.S. military buildup and armada remains poised in the region.
Jimena, Tyler was talking a little bit earlier there about threading the needle. I mean, this is something Delcy Rodriguez is going to need to do as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about the now acting president of Venezuela and the tightrope she's going to have to walk?
Definitely a tightrope. In Venezuela was functioning under a very tight regime that had an equilibrium and was very cohesive. Now, with the take on Maduro, that equilibrium is probably undermined, if not broken. Even though she's now the acting president, there are other strong leaders in Venezuela that have levers of power, different levers of power. And it is unclear that she has the full control of the regime and of the state. And so, to me, this transition that the administration is going for is unstable from that standpoint. She may be able to control the situation, and I think the administration was precisely going after that, and the reason why they are not sort of empowering the opposition is that they are trying to avoid empowering leaders that do not control all the levers of the state, and by this I mean in particular those that have the power of guns, the military and the police. But it is unclear that now that control by the regime, what is left of the regime, is so cohesive or as cohesive as it was before. So she will probably be walking that tightrope under pressure from internal elements who may be suspecting that she is negotiating with the U.S. to save her own skin, and with the U.S. administration who will probably put pressure on her both to undertake some economic policy measures pertaining to oil, probably, as well as to possibly undertake some institutional measures to pave the way for a transition, because we still think that the Trump administration, even though it was concerning that he did talk about the opposition not being capable and talking about this taking time, they always talked about a transition. So at some point at the end of the tunnel, which we don't know how long it will be, the administration seems to be still committed to going for a democratic outcome.
Jimena, I know you've been doing, along with the team, some geoeconomic analysis on what the scenarios are going to look like for Venezuela. What is the best case for the economy and diplomatic relations amid all this, especially keeping in mind the expectations that perhaps the Venezuelan diaspora might be able to return to the country?
Definitely. The best case, there are multiple scenarios and many unknowns, and things could go in unexpected ways. But the best case would be for the transition to be relatively brief, the transition to achieve, for example, the disarmament of militias, so that when the democratic opposition can take over, they can do so with control of security conditions, and that there is not an upsurge in violence, but that democratic transition does take place sooner than later. Why? Because in the current, if the transition lasts for too long, lingers for too long, then there will be other problems. There might be internal factions fighting for Delcy Rodriguez's place. There could be a fracture of the opposition, and then the path to a market-friendly, stable, pro-Western democracy might begin to get a bit more complicated. The opposition might start panicking that this is not happening and start mobilizing, and there could be protests and violence. So the best case is for the democratic transition to take place, because that could project a more convincing image of lasting political stability, which is foundational for economic recovery and for, as you say, Avril, for the many Venezuelans, over 8 million Venezuelans that have fled the country to begin returning.
Jimena, can you tell us a little bit more about Venezuela's oil assets as well? Because they are degraded after many years of neglect. And of course, it's not just the US that has interests in Venezuela. It's also China and a number of other countries have investments and assets there as well. How is this going to play out?
Absolutely. And this is what makes Venezuela so important. Venezuela used to be a country of high regional and global significance, not just because it was among the biggest and richest economies in Latin America, but because also it sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, accounting for about 17% of those reserves, the largest share in the world. The state of oil infrastructure has decayed a lot. There has been a collapse after years of mismanagement. Venezuela used to be the undisputed top producer in the region. Before the collapse, it was producing about 2.5 million barrels per day, and it's now slightly below 1 million. So the decrease has been substantial. And the upside is therefore also very large because it's assumed that if investment return, Venezuela could go back to that level of production. In fact, we've estimated that could bring further decline in oil prices, easing inflation pressures around the world. But for that to happen, I think it's fundamental that there are incentives that the Trump administration can probably provide. But in my opinion, it's also fundamental that oil companies can perceive those incentives as lasting. And I think that political stability and transition to democracy are best suited to provide that long-term horizon for investors, for investment to pick up.
Team, great to have you both to run us through the context here. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall at the White House and Bloomberg Economics LATAM geoeconomics analyst and Argentina economist Jimena Zuniga in Buenos Aires. Coming up on the Asia Train, we continue the conversation on Venezuela with the Council on Foreign Relations, Rystad Energy, and a former U.S. Army general. Much more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Let's get back to our top story on Venezuela and bring in Roxanna Vigil, International Affairs Fellow in National Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. Roxanna, thanks so much for joining us today. And still a lot of questions about what the near future holds for Venezuela, particularly in terms of how the U.S., in the words of President Trump, will run a sovereign country. How long do you see the U.S. involvement potentially lasting for here?
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions. I think one of the big concerns from President Trump's statements yesterday related to the latest in Venezuela is it wasn't clear whether there are plans for a transition to democracy, whether the Trump administration plans to work long term with a Chavista, a Maduro insider that will be in charge of the country, or whether Edmundo Gonzalez, who is the individual that won the last presidential election in Venezuela but was not allowed to transition to power because Maduro ended up stealing the election, whether he'll be able to return to Venezuela and govern. So a lot of really important questions. Unfortunately, the Trump administration does not seem to be prioritizing a transition to democracy at this point.
Yeah, and it's one thing to remove a leader, but of course a lot of the infrastructure remains. How many Maduro loyalists, cartel leaders are embedded in Venezuelan politics, and is it better to leave them there or get rid of the leadership entirely? What's the least worst option here?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the one hand, nothing is going to change if the people in power stay there at this point. So Maduro leaving is a good thing, but without the rest of the Chavista regime, the rest of the Maduro regime staying in power, without changes to the corrupt system that has led to so much of the deterioration in the oil sector, in the rest of the economy, if none of that changes, I wouldn't expect to see any meaningful changes in Venezuela. You're still going to have a very repressive government in control. And on top of that, you have the uncertainty related to the U.S. demands. Any Chavista that is in charge, including Delcy Rodriguez, who's claims to be in control right now, they are going to have a really tough time governing if they are faced with, on the one hand, appeasing the military in Venezuela and the hardliners within the regime, and on the other hand, capitulating to the U.S. government's demands, which President Trump has indicated is going to be a requirement for whoever's in charge.
Roxanna, talk to us about how much control you think amid all this the Trump administration might be able to actually realistically exert on the existing regime.
I think this part of the reason that there does need to be a plan or some sort of roadmap for returning Venezuela to democracy is because there's a lot of uncertainty without a clear roadmap. The Trump administration, I believe, thinks that there is some quick, easy solution to rebuilding Venezuela. There is not. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be very messy. There are going to need to be different political negotiations that take place to undo 20 plus years of a dictatorial regime. So my concern is, with time, I think what we'll see is more instability in Venezuela. We'll see a power struggle within the regime to take over control of the country, and we're likely to see an increase in violence, and we're likely to see sort of a deepening of the crisis in Venezuela without a transition to democracy.
As we've certainly seen in past instances, these transitions are not so straightforward. What is that going to mean for the security dynamic in the broader Latin American context?
It's a big concern because Venezuela has been a major exporter of instability in the region. Over 8 million Venezuelans have fled their country, and the countries that have received the most Venezuelans are Venezuela's neighbors. So you have Colombia with over 3 million Venezuelans that have fled there, and many other countries in the region with hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. And of course, the United States has been a recipient of Venezuelan migrants as well. So without a clear path to a more stable government and to a democratic government, the concern is that a new resurgence or a new wave of migration or instability will first and foremost affect Venezuela's neighbors. And it's at a time when many of the neighbors are going through their own challenges. Colombia, Ecuador, really challenging security situations in those countries. So it's a big concern. The spillover effect in the region is a major concern.
To that point, Roxanna, a few weeks ago, I was interviewing George Friedman on Bloomberg, a chairman of Geopolitical Futures. He was suggesting that regime change in Venezuela was a stepping stone to regime change in Cuba. Is that something you see potentially happening in 2026 or beyond?
It's really difficult to say. I think how this transition in Venezuela plays out, whether we see a Trump administration that's willing to work with a Chavista government and really makes no attempts to return Venezuela to a democracy, to me that would signal, on the one hand, a really big betrayal of the Venezuelan people and of their desire to return to democracy, given that they voted Maduro out of office in 2024. And it signals that, democracy and sort of a more stable, well-governed region is not really a priority. In that case, I guess that would bode well for Cuba. So it's really unclear. I think we'll have to wait and see what comes next in Venezuela.
A little earlier while you were speaking, we were seeing pictures of the Venezuelan diaspora in Madrid protesting in support of the removal of Maduro. One of the signs they were holding up was Delcy No, referring to Delcy Rodriguez, and Maria Corina Machado, yes. How accepting are the Venezuelan people going to be of Delcy Rodriguez as president, even in the near term?
I think it was a big surprise to hear President Trump yesterday say that he thought that Maria Corina Machado did not have the respect of the Venezuelan people to lead, given that she was the winner of the primary that took place in 2023 and was the individual that Venezuelan opposition voters elected to face Maduro. Maduro, of course, did not allow her to run, and she ended up supporting someone else that did end up winning the election instead. So I think it will be seen as a huge betrayal by the Trump administration of the Venezuelan people to not only call for Edmundo Gonzalez to govern, since he is the elected the person that won the election, and not support Maria Corina Machado, who is the opposition leader that the Venezuelan opposition voters chose to run against Maduro. It's surprising, and it's I think will continue to be seen as a big disappointment.
Roxanna, just one final question to you. Amid all this, there have been questions about the legality, whether this flouted international law. What is your sense of whether there will be accountability amid all this, and to what extent does it actually matter?
So the way that the world and the region in particular reacts to the U.S. intervention that took place in Venezuela does matter. The reality, though, is that countries in the region, they have come out and condemned some of the major players in the region, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. Those leaders have condemned strongly the U.S. intervention that took place in Venezuela. At the same time, it's not clear how much they'll be able to push back on the United States. They themselves are in their own conversations with the U.S. government related to their own interests, including related to economic issues, trade, other really important issues for these countries. So, without a real united response from the region and from other parts of the world, I think it will be really difficult to see some serious pushback.
Roxanna, we'll leave it there for today. Great to chat. Thank you so much for your analysis and your time with us today. Roxanna Vigil is International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now let's take a look at how markets are faring as well after the U.S. snatched Venezuela's president, triggering this fresh geopolitical flashpoint. Our chief markets editor, David Ingles, joins us from Hong Kong. David, what are we watching?
Yeah, well, initially, right, people talk about what this might mean for oil prices globally, and I think you guys spoke with Bloomberg Economics earlier on, and we fleshed out that call from them, right? So if you run the numbers, you look at a snapshot of what the current output is of Venezuela, all things equal, it's a 4% drop if they manage to get 1.5 million barrels a day in new supply come into the market, right? Because we're currently sitting at 1 million, just under that on current output. Before the implosion in the mid-2010s, we were at about 2.5. So that assumes that 1.5 build up to 2.5. And that assumes, of course, we're currently at about 100 million globally as far as daily output is concerned. So you add about 1.5 to that, that effectively means, according to Bloomberg Economics, a 4% drop over time. Right? Now, whether or not we'll see that in markets play out at the top of the hour, we'll see. Initially, though, when you look at markets right now, there's a slight hint of risk aversion, very slight. It's very early. So when you look at how the dollar is trading, the yen, the Swiss franc are trading stronger against the dollar. When you look at the other currencies like the Aussie, underperforming the dollar. The Mexican peso is underperforming almost everything else, which is, I guess, to the point I was making there on a slight hint of risk aversion. Although when you look at equity markets, futures, you look at New Zealand's up and running right now and how we might be trading going into the open today, there's not a lot lot out there, right? One thing I note, though, just before I go, obviously top of the next hour, you have everything from gold, silver, VIX futures, U.S. futures coming online, will be clearly the better indication of risk appetite. Just to mention as well, right, VIX at 14 almost doesn't give you any give as far as something like this is concerned. So we might see a reaction in VIX futures. Markets have been complacent for a very long time. It's not that risks are not present, but this read of market fear does underscore that complacency going into the open today. Guys, back to you.
All right, Bloomberg's chief markets editor David Ingles there. And given this happened over the weekend, hard to get a bead on how risk assets are tracking. We did see Bitcoin back above 90,000, though. Make of that what you will. Coming up on the Asia trade, CSIS and Prestige Economics joins us with their insights on the political and market implications of the capture of Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro. We'll have more on that in a moment. This is Bloomberg. Venezuela's allies around the world have condemned the U.S. attack and the arrest of President Maduro and his wife. Beijing says it's deeply shocked by the use of force against a sovereign state. Let's bring in our China correspondent Min Lo. Min, tell us a little bit more about China's reaction to this.
Yeah, look, China has joined a chorus of other voices that are friendly to Venezuela, including the likes of Brazil, Cuba, Russia, Mexico, to denounce the attack. And China is calling for the U.S. to ensure the safety and to release President Maduro and his wife, and also calling on the U.S. to halt any attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government, with Foreign Minister Wang Yi saying that no country can act as the world's policeman or claim to be an international judge. And of course, China is deeply shocked by this, understandably so, because just hours before those strikes, we know that a high-level Chinese delegation was meeting with President Maduro. And in the lead up to the strike, China has been expressing its support for the country amid months of pressure from the U.S., especially after the U.S. had seized those oil tankers. China's foreign ministry, Wang Yi, foreign minister, had said that Venezuela has the right to conduct relations with other countries as it sees fit. And the reason is because China has some skin in the game. It is one of the biggest buyer of Venezuelan oil. It is one of the biggest lender to Venezuela as well, having pumped in tens of billions of dollars in oil-backed loans to fund infrastructure investments, developmental projects. So you got to think about when the U.S. comes in claiming to want to run this country and bring in American oil company to take over some of the most strategic key assets in Venezuela, that is going to put some of China's strategic interests in the country under some threat as well.
Min, there's also been a lot of reaction on Chinese social media to the weekend event. Talk to us about how there's been a comparison that this could be a sort of Taiwan template.
Yes, indeed. There has been a lot of direct comparison being drawn in terms of what happened in Venezuela and what China could do to Taiwan. And you got to think about the message as well, right? If the U.S. views South America as its backyard where it can do whatever it wants, what is the message that is sending to other leaders of big countries, including President Putin and President Xi, in terms of what they can in turn do to what they view as within their spheres of influence? And Taiwan certainly is something that China views as its own sovereign territory by historical context. So some say that this could provide the opening for China to be more aggressive on Taiwan, and that is what many Chinese people on social media are heavily discussing right now. Although some analysts are saying that not necessarily so, right? Because this is also an opportunity for China to portray itself as that alternative leader, that upholder of international rules-based order that the U.S. had helped to create. And you also got to think about whether China's military military is ready, right? Some analysts are saying that China is not capable of carrying out an attack in the same way that the U.S. has done. China has gone through quite a bit of overhaul in its military with the anti-corruption probe as well. So some say that perhaps the calculus on Taiwan may not necessarily change because China has many other options. So far, of course, it has been conducting all these live fire drills around the island. It's been using diplomatic pressure and it's stopped short of violence, and that could continue to be the strategy going forward, but we'll have to see.
Min, thank you. Our Bloomberg China correspondent, Min Lo. Joining us now is retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs under President George W. Bush. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. As we've just been hearing from our colleague Min, there is a lot of conversation ongoing about whether this opens a path for China to ramp up aggression. But first, what is your take on the events over the weekend?
Well, I think what it demonstrates is that the United States has an unparalleled military capability to conduct military operations anywhere around the world of the most sensitive type. That said, we are beyond that military phase right now, and now we're going to get perhaps to the less dangerous part, but certainly not the less difficult part, which is we apparently have declared sovereignty over the state of Venezuela. And now, as we have seen in American adventures in the past, we will be going into the nation rebuilding phase, which is far, far more difficult.
Does that mean sending U.S. troops there to aid in this transition, which, as you allude to, will be difficult?
Well, we certainly hope not. In fact, I think some of the lessons that we have learned from past nation-building exercises is as long as stability on the ground exists from local forces, there is no need for United States military forces. And we certainly hope that that's what we will see over the next weeks and months ahead, that there is no need for an American stabilizing force on the ground.
Yeah, you served as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs under President George W. Bush, as Avril mentioned there in the introduction. Now, are there lessons from the regime change experience in Iraq and the years of chaos that followed that can be applied in Venezuela?
Well, I think there certainly are. In fact, I was in Iraq as part of that team in the first year. That was attempting to implement many of the policies coming out of Washington, D.C. While it is not an exact analogy, there are some lessons. And I think I would say the three lessons that I would offer to the team that will be conducting this operation is go lighter, go humbler, and do it with a significant amount of respect. I think that we went in perhaps too heavy, too ambitious, and too American when we went into Iraq. And I think, as you say, we saw the consequences of that action in the years that followed.
Do you feel perhaps that's part of the rationale behind leaving Vice President Delcy Rodriguez in charge as acting president for now, and not cleaning out the top ranks of their bureaucracy as well? And is there also like a history of democracy in Venezuela that might also be helpful?
Well, there is, and I think you bring up the most important point. One of the mistakes that was made in Iraq, and I think generally everyone agrees, is that we fundamentally lopped off the top 3 and 4 levels of management and administration inside the Iraqi government. Well, yes, there may have been a concern about their politics, the Ba'athification program, as we called it, but we seem to forget that they were the experts. They had been running the country for years and years. And if we do the same in Venezuela, where we have a litmus test that says anybody that has ever spoken well of Maduro, we will have no experts to run the government. As a result, we will have to run the government. As a result, we will be there longer and heavier. So let's hope that doesn't happen.
On top of the issue of governance, there's also, as we know, this vast Venezuelan military and army. What happens next to them on that front?
That's a very good question. As you know, that's the other great argument of the mistakes that were made in Iraq, the dismissal of the Iraqi security forces. Well, if you just send 400,000 paramilitary forces and military forces out of the ranks, out of their uniforms, and into their villages with no future, no pay, that's not going to be a force for good. We saw in the case of primarily the Sunni officers that were dismissed from the Iraqi army, they formed the core of the resistance that fought the Americans for years and years. So again, that same notion that you must go in and disband anybody that ever said anything good about Maduro or his collectivist ideology, I think is a very short-sighted approach to take, and I think most of my military colleagues would agree with me.
Picking up on the point earlier that was made about China and potentially this ramping up of aggression, what do you see as perhaps the calculus for the likes of China or Russia as they view what the U.S. has done with Venezuela?
Well, in the first case with Russia, in many ways, 4 years ago, President Putin started conducting his own Venezuela-type program when he went in with his special military operation into Ukraine. So let's put Russia to the side. China, on the other hand, I think it's important to explain through our diplomatic channels, must understand that we did not go into Venezuela because we felt we had any rights to it or any ownership of it. We didn't go in, and we are not taking it over forever. This was primarily a law enforcement operation to take out the leader and bring him to justice, a man who was responsible and directing the drug cartels that were responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And I don't think that we would have a whole lot to argue about if there was significant drug trade coming from Taiwan into China, killing hundreds of thousands of Chinese if the Chinese took action against that leader. So I think we need to understand what it is, why the president decided to do it, and what comes next.
In terms of what comes next, is Cuba potentially on the menu? Because it's very reliant on Venezuelan oil, and it's not difficult to see the template being used again.
Well, I really think that's a decision for Cuba to make. I think if Cuba sends the signals to the United States that it is not looking for a fight, it's looking to work more closely with the United States to handle the drug problems and the other illegal activities emanating from Cuba, I think we can continue to have this 50-year understanding between our two countries that would not lead to a military invasion. So that's Cuba's choice to make.
Just to bring us full circle, President Trump seems to have been ruling out Maria Corina Machado as a potential future president of Venezuela. Is this perhaps because she does not have the respect of the military, or is there another reason that you can think of?
Well, I would certainly hope that the reason that President Trump is at this point vetoing Machado is because he feels that there's an impediment between her and the people of Venezuela. Again, this is the whole notion of going in lighter. Whoever leads Venezuela must be the choice of the Venezuelan people, not dictated from outside forces, to include the United States. So let's see what the Venezuelan people want over the long term and not what perhaps America wants.
All right, that was retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs under President George W. Bush. Thank you so much for your time today, sir. Now, subscribers can catch our past interviews on our interactive TV function. You can check that out at TV Go. This is Bloomberg.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country.
President Trump speaking after the U.S. captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Joining us now is Jorge Leon, Senior Vice President and Head of Geopolitical Analysis at Rystad Energy. He previously served at OPEC from 2013 to 2018, where he was one of the lead authors of its flagship publication, The World Oil Outlook. Jorge, great to have you on the program. First off, given the uncertainty still, some clarification that is required on this latest escalation and really significant turn of events. What is your sense of how this will play out for global oil supplies, both in the short and longer term?
Good morning, Avril. Good morning, Paul. Thank you for having me. I think this is the big question right now. I think in the short term, it is really unknown at the moment what is going on, who's in control of the country, how stable, how transition would look like. And this is key for the oil market. We need to understand that in order for Venezuela to unlock its vast potential, 300 billion barrels of oil in reserves, there is a need for a stable government to attract international investment. So I think in the short term, what we're likely to see is supply disruptions in Venezuela. And in the long term, if the conditions on the ground are the correct ones, we could see additional barrels of oil from Venezuela in the long term. I don't think that this is a matter of 1-2 years. I think we're talking about 5 to 8 years before we see Venezuelan production really rapidly ramping up.
As you allude to, I think this is also a question for U.S. big oil and the extent in which, to Trump's goals, they would invest in Venezuela. What are you seeing realistically, given how perhaps lower oil prices at this point might be a deterrent to that?
That's a great point, exactly. We are in a world of oversupply in 2026. The oil market prices are likely to keep coming down. There might be a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine sometime soon that will be bearish for oil prices. So prices could easily fall to the low 50s in the coming weeks and months. So in that scenario, international oil companies are going to be extremely cautious to invest in somewhere else, particularly in countries such as Venezuela, where the political situation, the internal stability in the country is at risk at the moment. So I think that is going to prevent a rapid increase in production in Venezuela. The external environment in the oil markets matter massively right now.
And Jorge, of course, as you would know, not all oil is created equal. Venezuelan oil is particularly heavy crude. It's very high in sulfur. But U.S. Gulf refineries are quite well set up for this. So can you tell us a little bit about the synergies that are there, and maybe would that make it more cost effective?
That's the second important element here in this whole equation, right? I mean, Venezuelan crude is very specific. It's heavy crude. It is normally the U.S. refining system is well designed, let's say, to use to refine that kind of crude. Now you have a few countries that produce heavy crude. Venezuela is one. Another one is Canada, Mexico, Colombia, and Ecuador. And obviously production in Mexico, in Colombia, and Ecuador have been declining fast. And we've also seen Canadian exports deriving away from the U.S. and flowing much more towards Asia. So there's a little bit of a question mark there, is where is the U.S. refining system in the Gulf Coast going to take the heavy crude? And Venezuelan crude is the perfect solution to that problem, if you want. So there's a perfect match in that sense. And we've seen volumes of heavy crude flowing back to the U.S. Through Chevron with a very specific license, around 200,000 barrels per day in the last few months, going from Venezuela to the U.S. But in time, these flows could rapidly increase.
Well, it's not just U.S. companies, of course, that have interests in Venezuelan oil assets. There are also Spanish, Italian, French companies operating there, and, of course, Chinese investment as well. So how do you see this working together if you've got a government that's run by a government approved by the U.S.?
That is another great question. And the problem here is that in order for attract international companies, first of all, you need to solve the underinvestment in infrastructure of the oil sector in Venezuela, and also you would need to solve other problems such as the skilled manpower problem that Venezuela has at the moment. I am not convinced that international companies, whether they're Americans or Europeans or even Chinese companies, will rush back into the country before understanding that the situation is stable enough. In the case of China, it's a very specific situation because those companies are there because of the huge amount of loans that the Chinese government has provided to Venezuela over time. So part of that crude is used to repay those loans. Now, and there is a question mark: what is going to happen now with those loans? I'm sure China would not allow for those loans to be lost. So that is a big question mark that will need to be solved in the next few days and a few weeks.
Jorge, to your point earlier about what we might see in terms of U.S. firms' investment into Venezuela, do you get a sense that the Trump administration could quite strongly encourage these U.S. firms to go ahead with investments in spite of whether it might make business sense for them to do so?
I was actually quite surprised that after President Trump's statement yesterday, where he said that American oil companies were going to invest vast amount of money in Venezuela, we haven't really heard about the American oil companies. We haven't heard Russia Brown, we haven't heard about Exxon or ConocoPhillips. They haven't really seen, and I would have expected them to come out right after saying, yes, we are there, we're on board, and we're going to invest. And it's a worrying signal that they haven't really said anything. Let's not forget, yes, these are American companies, but these are private companies that try to maximize shareholder value. So they will take those decisions of where to invest money, trying to maximize the value for shareholders. So that is a worrying signal for me. I was quite surprised about that.
Jorge Leon, thank you so much for joining us today. Jorge Leon is Senior Vice President and Head of Geopolitical Analysis at Rystad Energy. Going to leave you with live pictures out of Caracas. Uncertainty looming over Venezuela.
We'll be keeping an eye on oil markets when trade begins in a few minutes. Of course, beyond what's happened over the weekend, we will have to unpack the short-term as well as the longer-term implications for global oil supplies from the U.S. move on Venezuelan leader Maduro's. And of course, this is coming of a year where oil prices have already ended with their steepest annual loss since 2020. The global benchmark slumping already towards the 60 handle. That's what we'll be keeping a watch on, the extent of the move when trading begins in the next hour, Paul.
Yeah, let's take a look at how U.S. futures are looking at the moment. And, of course, those oil companies are going to be in focus at the open. We've got S&P futures currently better by 0.1%. Chevron's the only U.S. oil major currently working in Venezuela under special license. It exports about 140,000 barrels a day to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, and it produces about 20% of Venezuela's oil. But that's kind of it. ConocoPhillips says in a statement that it's monitoring the situation. Premature to speculate on any future business activity, and Exxon had no comment as of, about 12 hours ago. It's previously said that it would look at investing into Venezuela, but only under the right conditions. So still a lot of uncertainty there. We'll be keeping a close eye on not only those U.S. oil majors at the open, but also oil majors in Asia when we get underway with trading in just a couple of hours' time. We will leave you with live pictures out of Caracas. Uncertainty over who's in charge looming over Venezuela. We'll bring you more answers in a moment. This is Bloomberg.
There's a quarantine right now in which sanctioned oil shipments, there's a boat, and that boat is under U.S. sanctions. We go get a court order, we will seize it. That remains in place. And that's a tremendous amount of leverage that will continue to be in place until we see changes, not just further the national interest of the United States, which is number one, but also that lead to a better future for the people of Venezuela.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio on U.S. plans for Venezuela's oil. Oil markets have just opened for the first time since the U.S. incursion in Venezuela. Let's get to our chief markets editor, David Ingles. David.
Yeah, initial pricing, I'm looking across these U.S. assets. Why don't we start off with West Texas? We also obviously are looking at precious metals in case we are getting this sort of shift into the haven place right now. Coming up on your screens, we're looking at lower crude at the open. It's very, very early. To caveat, it's also Monday, and it's also, of course, the very first full trading day of the year across most markets. So I'm just mentioning that because there might be some liquidity issues which might be exacerbating some of the price moves. But as expected, lower on the oil price. We are richer across the precious metals curve. As you can see, silver's up 3% in the early goings. Platinum's up 2.7%. Flip the page, please, and have a look at where we're trading as far. And by the way, just to mention while we flip the page, Brent trades later on as well. We'll get you an update once that, of course, gets underway. U.S. futures steady, slightly to the upside. Bonds are trading slightly on the poorer side. And as you can see, VIX futures are also to the downside. So initial verdict for markets, risk appetite, no issue there as far as developments over the weekend are concerned. Again, it's very, very early. Let's have a look at how we're doing across Australia and, of course, some of the gold miners there and energy plays, as well as what we're tracking there as well. And we are looking at some upside. Of course, this is a market that opens very, very slowly, so we'll wait for this to really get warmed up. Very quickly, let me just end with a look at currency markets, which perhaps I would say is probably still the best indicator for risk appetite right now. And as you can see, we're looking at Nikkei futures, and we mentioned, right, so you have the Japanese currency and the Swiss currency. Earlier, we're trading on the stronger side of things. We're now weaker as far as that's concerned. And of course, the weakness that has come through in the Mexican peso in the last 60 minutes or so has somewhat also been alleviated. So currently, and it's very early, let me just end on this, it's looking like markets are taking this one well in stride. Guys, back to you.
All right, that's Bloomberg's chief markets editor, David Ingles there. Well, global financial markets may face a skittish start to the week. We'll see after the U.S. ousted Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, over the weekend, triggering a fresh flashpoint that may stoke geopolitical tensions and possibly curb the flow of oil from the region, at least for the time being. Now, let's get to Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, Tyler Kendall, who's at the White House, Bloomberg Opinion columnist Juan Pablo Spineto in Buenos Aires, and Becca Wasser, who leads Bloomberg's Economics defense coverage, joining us from Washington, D.C. I want to start with you first, JP. I mean, we've got still Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, now in charge. What's the rationale behind keeping Nicolas Maduro's number two in power?
The rationale is trying to continue running the country because that's something that, despite what President Trump said, the U.S. cannot do remotely. Chavismo may have been decapitated with the capture of Maduro, but they still control all the key institutions in the country, including the military, social programs, justice system. Everything is controlled by Chavismo. So this idea that there will be all remove and airlift a new government, I think it wasn't realistic. The idea of keeping Delcy Rodriguez is trying for some time to continue running the country under the orders of Washington and see if there is a transition later on.
Tyler, let's bring you in here. This is a culmination of a months-long military campaign by the U.S., and yet at the end of this, there are still perhaps more questions and answers in terms of the justification from the Trump administration on this. What are we hearing? What is the latest?
next point, as you're saying here at the White House, a lot of questions here about what happens going forward and the legality behind the administration's strikes. Now, it is clear that President Trump has put front and center the idea that the U.S. will have a vested economic interest in Venezuela's oil reserves going forward. That's part of why this White House has maintained that it feels it has a lot of leverage in what happens next, considering that officials maintain that that embargo on Venezuelan oil still remains in place. And President Trump has also pledged that U.S. companies are going to play a much larger role going forward. There are also a big emphasis here by the administration when it comes to cracking down on the trade of illicit narcotics. And that's why it is going to be incredibly important. And we're going to learn more tomorrow, as within the last hour we have learned that Nicolas Maduro and his wife will appear in person at a federal courthouse in Manhattan at 12 p.m. Eastern, where they are, of course, indicted on these narco-terrorism conspiracy and also drug trafficking charges.
Becca, let's talk a little bit more about what happens next in Venezuela, because there's a number of potential outcomes here. I mean, there could be post-Saddam Hussein Iraq-style chaos, or there could be a flourishing of democracy, which is not completely unfamiliar to Venezuela. What's the most likely outcome?
Well, I can't tell you what the most likely outcome is, but I do think that there are a range of potential futures, one of which is more of this Iraq-style form of governance where you have the U.S. in this position of supporting a caretaker government. We are potentially likely to see that case if the current vice president is unable to govern. There's also a potential future and pathway in which it does lead to democracy, but that might be a very, very slow process if we're reading into some of the comments that have been made by Marco Rubio and others, where it seems as though they really seem to support the idea of having some type of continuity at the moment before potentially shifting more towards opposition rulers, rulers coming in and supporting what might be more of the will of the people. And then there's also the wild card scenario of there is an uptick in chaos and violence that might occur within the country based on there being a potential governance vacuum. It seems as though the U.S. is very much trying to avoid that where possible, which is where you do have some of President Trump's comments and some of the comments that were made earlier today by Secretary of State Rubio.
JP, there's this talk, as our colleague just mentioned, on this path to democracy. What is your assessment of the extent in which the opposition will need to be involved in this process in order for any of this to hold water?
Yeah, it's a very unstable situation because you have, arguably two very different political leaderships. You have Trump and you have Chavismo. And basically, they're trying to work together under the threat that if they don't do what the Americans want, then the fate of Maduro could happen to Delcy or to whoever is in power. But at the same time, we know for after the 2024 election that the will of the people is in the opposition. So the opposition is standing waiting to see when it's going to have this political transition, when we're going to have an election. And that's why I say this window will shut very quickly. We'll have to see in the incoming months, weeks, not more than a few months, if this is workable. Because then we're going to have the same pressure from the opposition calling for elections. And at the same time, we have, as I said, the prospect of Delcy having to do what the Americans want. She has also to deliver to her base, which is radically opposed to the Americans. So I see a very unstable, I see a path, but it's a very unstable situation, and we'll need to see successes in the few next weeks.
Tyler, can you tell us a little bit more about how much appetite there is for U.S. involvement in Venezuela, not just among the U.S. public, but also among U.S. lawmakers, particularly considering this seems to be a little bit of a departure from President Trump's earlier remarks when it comes to regime change?
Right, exactly. And also the broader backdrop, Paul, of what President Trump largely campaigned on, which was staying out of foreign entanglements. Just look at his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, who was chosen in part because of his populist views when it comes to foreign policy. On the Hill, we are seeing this divide. Of course, on one end, Republicans and defense hawks are widely applauding this move by the administration. But as we discussed last hour on this program, Democrats are really trying to thread the needle here when it comes to being in favor of Nicolas Maduro no longer being in power, but opposed to how the Trump administration went by these strikes. Because, of course, at the center of this conversation are questions around the legality, considering that the U.S. Constitution gives the primary authority to Congress to declare war, or at least through the War Powers Act of 1973, it curbs the president's power to use military force without consulting or at least previously notifying the U.S. Congress. Now, if you ask White House officials here, they'll give you a different range of justifications behind this action, including that they didn't want a leak from Congress, considering that a confluence of factors had to go into effect in order for them to trigger this mission. And the second is that you're going to hear officials talk about this being executing a law enforcement action, considering that Maduro is under indictment and that military force was needed in order to protect those on the ground that were executing that arrest warrant. So we'll see where this goes moving forward here, but I would expect some big questions in the days ahead from Congress about how this came to be, though we can confirm that House Speaker Mike Johnson says that the administration is working on setting up a series of briefings for U.S. lawmakers in the week ahead.
Becca, what is your sense of what other U.S. adversaries might be thinking, or the calculus for them, given the most recent move by the Trump administration?
Well, I think we should look at some of the countries that are regionally based and then some of the countries that are further afield, including those that the U.S. is in broader strategic competition with, like China. So regionally, I do think that there are a number of countries that feel as though they've been put on notice. I think Cuba is very much in that category, particularly after Marco Rubio's remarks yesterday, where he pretty much said that, any potential country that is working against U.S. interests should be very worried. He obviously has a focus on Cuba for multiple reasons, but I think that that's one. I think also we have seen comments against some of the leaders in Colombia, in Mexico. So there's very much a focus right now on some of the ways in which this might be causing some tension with those countries and some of the fears that they might have, which may be a coercive element to try and get them to fall in line with some of the Trump administration's priorities. But further afield, I think this is also putting countries like Iran, Russia, and China on notice, and they're also watching very closely the military operation and seeing what it is they could learn from it, not only for their own potential actions in the future, but also for how they might be able to go up against the United States should they ever need to in the future. So there's a bit of, military operational statecraft right now that's happening and occurring, and U.S. adversaries are most certainly watching and learning.
Becca, is it reasonable to anticipate that the U.S. might have a little bit of trouble engaging some of the players in the political scene in Venezuela? Because, of course, a lot of the Chavistas, Maduro loyalists are still in place in the bureaucracy and the military as well. And surely there has to be a future role for Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado as well.
One would hope that there would be a future in which the will of the Venezuelan people is heard and is very much involved. But right now, there's too much to actually say which direction this is going to go in. But I do think you raise a really important point, which is that there are a number of interest groups right now in Venezuela, the military being one of them, that do feel as though they've played a role in Venezuela up to this point and will continue to play a role in Venezuela. Exactly what that role looks like remains to be seen, but the fact is they have benefited from years of patronage under the Maduro regime, and some of those patronage networks and the level of support that they have received, they expect that to continue. So exactly who ends up, in jockeying for the best position of power, who is able to be represented, we don't quite know yet, but we are going to see the way in which a number of these interest groups might actually band together to work in shared interests, but also the ways in which they might be working potentially against some of what the U.S. is hoping to kludge together in support.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you to you, team. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Opinion columnist Juan Pablo Spinetto, and Becca Wassa, who leads Bloomberg Economics defense coverage. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
President Trump there speaking on oil in Venezuela. Let's bring in Ryan Berg, director of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, for analysis on this. Ryan, great to have you on the program. First off, we are seeing the comments from the U.S. president about running things, leaving more question marks at this stage. What is your sense of what that means, what that might actually entail?
Well, thanks for having me on, Avril. It's a pleasure to be with you. So last night, or yesterday morning, I should say, when the president gave those remarks at the press conference, it sounded more like a provisional government type situation that he wanted to set up. He pointed to the back and said Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, maybe even General Dan Kane, the Joint Chiefs, would be involved, as well as some Venezuelan officials. This morning on the morning talk shows in the United States, Secretary of State Rubio clarified that he means that Venezuelan officials will still be making decisions. However, the U.S. retains an immense amount of leverage, especially given that the quarantine on sanctioned vessels in the Southern Caribbean remains in place. And so what I think is meant here is that the U.S. will continue to exercise influence over the decisions that are made in Venezuela, but that there won't be some kind of provisional government between the United States and Venezuela. And if the United States doesn't see the kinds of decisions out of Caracas that it wants to see, it will not hesitate to take action, much like the one that it took against Nicolas Maduro. So that plus the quarantine is, I think, what the administration believes gives them the leverage to try to move things in a pro-U.S. direction in Venezuela.
What exactly, in your mind, are the moves that the Trump administration wants Caracas to take?
Well, I think we can look at the issues or the reasons why the president and all of his political appointees have given for why Venezuela is such a priority so far in the second Trump administration. Number one, it's drugs. Number two, it's migration. And number three, it's the geopolitics of the region. And so I think the Secretary of State was clear this morning on the morning shows as well. It's fewer drugs coming to the United States. It's seeing the Venezuelan government disentangle itself from some of these drug trafficking networks, do more domestically to fight narcotics, to reduce the amount of migration, and to accept more migration flights back to Venezuela, and probably most importantly, to sever itself from some of these connections to U.S. adversaries. Iran, China, Russia, the Cuba-Venezuela connection is very deep. We could go on in terms of the number of alliances, but I think those are some of the metrics that will soon be apparent in terms of whether this regime is actually changing its behavior or whether it's the same old regime.
In terms of the regime, I mean, there are a number of Maduro loyalists still in place, some Chavistas as well. We were speaking last hour about perhaps the advantages of doing that and not repeating some of the mistakes when the US pursued regime change in Iraq. Do you see the US as behaving perhaps differently this time?
It's a great question, Paul, and I think the only way that I see this working out is if Delcy Rodriguez, the de facto vice president of Venezuela, who will now be making many of those decisions, is a fill-in, is a temporary solution to a longer-term challenge, which is getting to greater democratic legitimacy in Venezuela. You said it in the previous panel. I agree with some of the previous commentators. It's going to be very difficult to make this work, given the differences in approach between that regime and those who have been a part of it and the United States, irrespective of who would be running policy in the United States. So she makes sense only as a kind of stopgap solution between Nicolas Maduro and Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González Urrutia, or a new election in Venezuela where some of those same individuals would compete once again. It may have been made the calculation that that transition from Maduro to Machado and Edmundo would be simply too much of a shock therapy, let's call it, for the system to handle, and that there needed to be some kind of middle ground before eventually moving to a democratic transition. If that's the case long term, it might prove to be a sound strategic play, but too much remains to be seen at this point to know whether that's actually the strategy.
Ryan, in terms of this being a stopgap solution, then, as you say, what's a realistic timetable for fresh elections in Venezuela, and what are the risks to getting there?
Well, I think just looking at how much effort it took to bring elections in Venezuela in 2024, when the opposition did win its decisive victory in a highly unfree and unfair election, that election took multiple months to be able to organize and for the opposition parties to sort out an internal primary that would decide an actual unified winner to then move forward and challenge the regime. And so at best, I think you're talking about the end of 2026, probably moving into 2027. This is going to take concerted effort on behalf of the United States. We're going to have to stay very, very focused, avoid getting distracted by other geopolitical situations around the world if we truly want Venezuela to move from what I think is probably a stopgap solution right now to that democratic transition with Maria Corina and Edmundo.
What is your sense of the way in which the current regime is actually viewing some of the other influences in Venezuela, the likes of China or even Russia, Iran, all sort of markets for Venezuelan energy?
Well, those relationships are entirely up in the air right now. We know that they've been key for the regime in the past, but it's always had a connection to the regime's security. And right now, what I think is most interesting is that those regimes, that axis of authoritarians, as we're calling them, has not been there for the regime in terms of its regime security at the moment of greatest need. They did not intervene to help protect Nicolas Maduro. At best, Russia provided him, quote, political solidarity, but it's completely consumed in Ukraine. And so there might possibly be a reassessment within Caracas of what those governments actually mean for the regime and the regime's security. And that would actually dovetail with what the United States is asking it to do. Sever those connections, change the policy, don't serve as a beachhead for some of these adversaries to have a presence in the Western Hemisphere.
There's been a narrative, of course, emerging that this is all about oil. What is your sense of whether the Trump administration is setting its sights on another regime beyond this?
Well, I think the conversation about Venezuela can't be a conversation about Venezuela without touching on the oil. The United States has said that it wants Venezuela to have a chance at prosperity. Oil is the lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy. It always has been. So for Venezuela to have a chance at recovery, the oil industry has to increase production. But I do think that one of the things that the Trump administration would like to see is the Venezuela-Cuba nexus, especially as it pertains to oil production. Venezuela used to give a lot of oil to Cuba. Some of it was used for domestic consumption. A lot of it was sold onward to international markets, netting revenue for the Cuban regime. It wants to see that connection severed in order to put more pressure on the Cuban regime. It would like to see the nexus between oil and China, oil and Venezuelan oil, Venezuelan oil and Iran, those connections to be severed as well.
Ryan, just briefly, where would you place the odds of us seeing regime change in Cuba within the next 12 months?
Look, Cuba is in one of its worst situations since the so-called special period in the 1990s. The regime there having a lot of trouble holding on. For now, the repressive apparatus remains effective in terms of keeping the discontent, keeping a lid on the discontent. But there is a decent chance that we could see change in Cuba, especially since there is such a strong connection between what happens in Venezuela and the survival of the Cuban regime. So I do think that things could potentially move in very significant ways in 2026 in the Western Hemisphere.
All right, Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS, thank you so much for joining us today. We have more ahead as we continue to unpack the unfolding situation in Venezuela and its implications for markets as well. This is the Asia Trade, and this is Bloomberg.
You're either on the side of international law or on the side of the law of the strongest. The countries of CELAC must step forward because silencing faith in this aggression is equivalent to following it.
Venezuela's allies around the world have condemned the U.S. attack and the arrest of President Maduro and his wife. In the meantime, we are watching for China's reaction as well. Beijing says it's deeply shocked by the use of force against a sovereign state. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Lo. Min, talk to us about the Beijing reaction to all this.
Yeah, Beijing has been joining other countries like Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, Russia to denounce the attack. And Beijing particularly concerned over this forcible detention and deportation of Maduro and his wife, calling on the U.S. to keep them safe and to release the leaders of a sovereign nation here, and also calling on the U.S. to stop any attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government, with the foreign minister Wang Yi saying that no country should act as the world policeman or claim to be an international judge here. And also Beijing was deeply shocked, right, as you said, because just hours before those strikes, a high-level Chinese delegation was meeting with President Maduro, and China has been, building up its ties with Venezuela, especially amid the growing pressure from the U.S. over the last few months, especially after the U.S. had blockaded or seized those oil tankers from Venezuela. And this is coming as China has been the biggest oil buyer of Venezuela. It is also the biggest creditor as well. It's pumped in, by some estimates, about $60 billion into Venezuela over the past many years in oil-backed loans to fund infrastructure investment, developmental projects, energy projects. So if the U.S. comes in to run a country like Venezuela and bring in those, big U.S. oil companies to take over those important assets, it's going to put a threat on China's interests in the region as well.
Min, tell us a little bit about some of the commentary that's been on Chinese social media, particularly in terms of comparing the U.S. experience in Venezuela to China's interests in Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it is sending a message to leaders like President Xi and even President Putin as well, right? If the U.S. views South America as its backyard where it can do whatever it wants, then what does that mean for President Xi and Putin in terms of what they can do and what they view as their spheres of influence? And China definitely sees Taiwan as a part of its own territory, not even a separate sovereign nation, so that all the more it gives them the justification to perhaps be more aggressive in taking back Taiwan. So that is being heavily discussed on Chinese social media right now, although some analysts are saying that perhaps the Chinese military may not be as capable as the U.S. to do what it did, right, to extract a leader of another nation alive. And people are saying that, China may not be able to extract Lai Ching-te alive. They have other options. Assassination attempts may be more successful, but still, China's overall strategy right now is a lot of live fire drills, diplomatic pressure to isolate Taiwan. They have stopped short of using violence or force as of now, and some analysts are saying that could still remain the status quo, because after all, this is still an opportunity for China to present itself as this alternative world leader and upholder of international law, and an alternative to the U.S.
All right, Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Min Lo there. Let's get to Alicia Garcia Herrero now, Chief APAC Economist at Natixis. Alicia, thanks so much for joining us today. And it's good timing because you used to work in Venezuela. I know you visited recently. You've got friends there as well. And it's, of course, the U.S. isn't the only country with interest there. As Min Min was saying, China has significant interest there. A delegation was visiting just as Maduro was captured by U.S. forces. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you see as the future of Chinese investments in Venezuela, as well as Chinese citizens who live and work there?
Well, China has had it still has very large commercial relations with Venezuela. At the highest end, of course, Chinese oil companies, state-owned oil companies, and this is really what is behind those 60 billion loans that started right before the global financial crisis in 2008. It's not very clear, though, that China still has basically a loan of 60 billion. The most likely scenario is that this loan has been reduced by basically sizing Venezuelan assets, part of which are oil-related, upstream-related. Sinovenza, for example, is a JV between PDVSA, the Venezuelan oil company, and China. So probably China has more equity now than actual loans, in my view. But the reality is that all of this equity means that the relations, even human relations, are huge. Yeah, I mean, beyond the upstream oil, there's a lot of other sectors, construction, you name it. Also because Venezuela invoices all of its oil, which is more than 90% going to China. Around 4% of Chinese imports of oil come from Venezuela, 600,000 barrels a day. But all of that for Venezuela is all it has in terms of exports. So it all comes in RMB. And that means that anything that Venezuela needs to do in terms of, again, construction, imports obviously come from China. So it is a very, very important relation for Venezuela. And in some way, it is also important for China, although obviously at a lesser extent.
Can you talk to us a little bit as well about the implications of the events we've seen in Venezuela over the weekend for global risk appetite? Because at the moment, the early stages in Asia on Monday, really markets seem to be just shrugging this off.
Yeah, well, markets shrug of everything, as we know lately. I would say since Trump came to power, any geopolitical event, and by the way, let's not forget North Korea actually tested missiles as we speak, and nothing happened. So, we also have the North Korea risk at a time where, the South Korean leader is visiting Beijing. So you can't understand markets. As far as geopolitics are concerned, they're just shrugging off everything, as I mentioned. But I do think it's important because there's two things here that relate to Asia. One is, of course, Taiwan. How will China read Venezuela? There's two readings. One is, nobody's going to tell me that I shouldn't do whatever I may have to do. But secondly, it could be fear. Yeah, the U.S. has proven to be pretty targeted in terms of reaching a leader, taking away a leader. I mean, that's not something that is easy to do. So we don't really know how China will read this in a way. There's two readings in my view, and we still need to see what will unfold. will the U.S. Basically bring Venezuela back to democracy, or just profit from a non-Maduro type autocratic state in Venezuela? If the latter, that opens the door to potentially other events in Asia, in my view. Whether it's Russia, there's many things that could happen that are negative for markets that we may not be reading yet.
Alicia, as you allude to, it seems like the takeaway here is we are moving into a more fragmented world, not just developments of the weekend, but in the past year. What is that going to mean for the current ongoing realignment of global trade, and how does that actually impact the outlook for Asia economies?
Well, the story here, I think Trump 2.0 was, Trump comes with tariffs and we're going to basically get closer to China in terms of trade, because that's what ASEAN has been doing, and that pays off. Yes, China is still today importing too little, but at least it's kind of a non-tariff related market. We don't need to be forced to invest in the US. That was the world up to the beginning of this year. I think this event in Venezuela shows that that's not going to be so easy. Yeah, if you get too close, if you become a vassal state of China, which is what Venezuela was, maybe even with some hints from Russia. Russia also had $6 billion actually lent to Venezuela when China was at the peak, $60 billion. So that combination, maybe you don't want to be there, and that is what we've learned here. So it is fragmented, but it's riskier. It's not only about trade. It's not only about tariffs. It's not only about forced investment. It's that you may end up losing your power if you're a leader. So that means that taking sides here, as was happening before, could become riskier and more expensive. That gives the U.S. a little bit of a hands up, but only if the U.S. handles this well, which is very unlikely, to be frank, because this is a very messy situation.
What about your assessment of the extent in which, going forward, this realignment, how exactly is that going to benefit some of these economies in Asia that are perhaps more tech focused? Given to Paul's point, they seem to be overlooking or looking past these geopolitical developments.
Yeah. That's right. When we look at Asia's performance in 2025, is basically exports, which is ironic given the tariffs. But it is because the U.S. demand for Asian exports, and especially tech-related, at the highest end, that's Taiwan, basically, close to 100% increase in exports, mostly to the U.S. And then even Malaysia, whether it's AI chips packaging or other types of chips for that matter, lower end, even Chinese exports of chips beyond the U.S., obviously elsewhere, and maybe re-exported to the U.S. All of that is a story that has nothing to do with the geopolitical situation. And that's why we see this shrugging off. It's because the market is still on AI and tech, while the world is in Venezuela. And Venezuela has no tech. So, there's no link. But for how long can you keep that disconnect? I would argue that you just need to see something related to Taiwan, and then things change, because that's the origin of all of these high-end chips, which everybody needs, including NVIDIA. So, the relation with the stock market would clearly change if we saw any signal that Taiwan is at risk.
All right, Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief APAC Economist at Natixis. Thanks so much for joining us. The top global headlines that we're following today. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has arrived in Beijing for his first trip to China since taking office. He's set to meet President Xi Jinping on Monday in a bid to steady ties with a key economic partner. Also on the agenda are trade and security issues, including North Korea's latest ballistic missile launch and, of course, tensions over Taiwan. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has threatened a crackdown on rioters amid unrest sparked by a collapse in the local currency. Khamenei says that while the grievances behind the protests were justified, he also blames external forces for rising food prices and currency volatility. The Supreme Leader spoke on Saturday in his first public appearance after a week of protests. Saudi Arabia has called for Yemen's southern factions to enter into talks with Riyadh as clashes continue between Saudi-backed forces and separatist rivals backed by the UAE. In a foreign ministry statement, Saudi Arabia says the upcoming conference aims to find just solutions. The UAE has denied Saudi allegations it's directing separatist groups in the region in an attempt to undermine security. All right, let's take a look at how commodities are doing, particularly oil in focus. As you might expect, a little bit weaker. Brent crude now off about a 0.25%, 60.61. It's still above the session lows that we've seen, but the prospect of yet more supply entering an already flooded market depressing oil prices. OPEC Plus had a meeting over the weekend, reaffirming its decision to leave production unchanged for the first quarter. Didn't even address the Venezuela issue. OPEC Plus standing on the sidelines for now, waiting to see how things unfold. We do have energy stocks performing pretty well here in Australia. Meanwhile, that's the best performing sector, up by 1.3%. Otherwise, a bit of a mixed picture. Gold, another beneficiary of all the upheaval and geopolitical uncertainty, continuing to press higher, 4,361 an ounce at the moment. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Japanese markets will open at the top of the next hour, and despite those developments over the weekend with the U.S. incursion of Venezuela, you are more or less looking at risk assets shrugging things off, and we are also keeping tabs on, of course, some of the developments related to oil prices. Let's bring in Nick Smith, Japan strategist at CLSA, for some analysis on this. So, Nick, we are looking at, in terms of assets, I think whatever happened over the weekend, markets seem to be quite clear in that maybe they're shrugging some of this off. What is your read into this in terms of the potential impact, if at all, on Japan and the extent in which we can see a bit of outperformance for the year ahead?
Sure. I mean, I don't think at the moment there's nothing we've heard about this that suggests it's going to impact Japan in a big way. I think when people are concerned about the global situation, there's something of a strengthening in the yen that you often hear. A lot of people are talking about a collapse in the oil price, but I wonder whether it's not a good idea to look in the opposite direction and say we could have some supply disruptions. It's possible that oil prices won't fall that much. I can't help thinking that it will bring to front of mind things like Japan's spending on defence. And whilst previously I'd talked in terms of Japan not really breaching 2%, it's already agreed to go for defence spending from 1% to 2%. And given its balance sheet, it wouldn't be a good thing to spend more. But I think increasingly we're hearing about Japan upping its defence spending even beyond that number. So I think those defence-related stocks ought to be front of mind in the market this morning.
What about energy-related stocks in Japan, Nick? What is your sense of how the play might evolve in 2026 for them?
Well, I mean, I think surely the problem with Japan over the last few years, we've had a problem with a weak yen that's meant that energy prices have been high. The government's tried to combat the effects of the the weak yen on food and on gasoline particularly, so it's giving tax breaks for gasoline and for energy this year. But if oil prices do ultimately, or energy prices do actually come down a bit, that I think is a good thing for Japan. I mean, obviously, on the other side, we've also got a Japan that's been faffing around for a dozen years, not dealing with nuclear restarts. So it used to take 30% of electricity from nuclear, and it's had those highly expensive nuclear plants sitting around doing nothing for a dozen years. And finally, it's got a prime minister with the backbone to push through restarts. We're getting Kashiwazaki Kariwa, one of the plants, probably starting up this month, with another unit starting up by March. And what people really miss is, if you look at Japan's trade now deficit against its imports of oil, they move exactly opposite to each other. In other words, the only reason that Japan has a trade deficit is because Fukushima took out its nuclear capacity and caused it to import a huge amount of hydrocarbons. So if it can get nuclear restarted and stop relying on oil so much, and its oil costs go down, then I think it goes into trade surplus, and that feeds into the stronger yen. If you have a trade surplus as well as its current account surplus, that I think is positive for the yen.
Yeah, Nick, tell us a little bit more about your yen outlook for 2026. Where do you see the next ceiling or floor being?
Oh, wow. I'm way too young to have ever experienced Japanese rates going in a different direction, going up when the rest of the world is coming down. Obviously, in terms of US rates, the president is very keen on getting a Fed chief that will bring down rates for him. And I think the numbers they're talking about, I mean, Japan moves in baby steps. The US, particularly if Kevin Hassett is made Fed chief, would move in 7-league boots. And therefore, we have the potential for the yen to move quite firmly stronger from here. And I think once you think in terms of a stronger yen, you've got to remember, especially with the narrowing of the yield gap, you've got to think in terms of what happens with Japan's vast assets overseas. So it's got $500 billion in the yen carry trade. Other people taking advantage of Japan's cheap rates to invest everywhere apart from Japan. But also since 1996, Japan's investments overseas are up $3.9 trillion. So that's the big bit. And all of that, you've been saying, well, zero yield at home, so I put my money offshore. And it really helps that the yen keeps on weakening. So that's the gift that kept on giving. But if you get a situation where the yen strengthens, then you panic. You say, I no longer, everything that I'm gaining on the yields, just a small movement in the yen wipes that out. I need to get out of this trade before it kills me. And once you bring your money home, you push the yen even stronger and push the next person to bring their money home. So there is a real risk of an unwind in the yen carry trade, and then the Japan's portfolio investments offshore. That I think is a potential big move. And you remember when we had an unwind in the yen carry trade in July last year, it knocked 25% off NASDAQ in 20 days?
All right, Nick, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thanks for joining us today. That's Nicholas Smith, Japan strategist at CLSA. And you can catch Japan Ahead every Monday, 8:40 a.m. if you're watching in Tokyo. And subscribers can watch live on the terminal using the TV Go function. This is Bloomberg.
As we watch for developments between the U.S. and Venezuela, it looks like markets are pretty much shrugging the developments over the weekend off, despite the escalation in geopolitical tensions. And we are seeing some risk appetite creeping back in, even looking at how Nikkei futures are pointing to gains at the open. And you're seeing moves sideways on U.S. futures. In Australia, the mining energy shares are helping to support the index. It looks like, though, the clear play for now in commodities is that pressure continuing downward on oil prices and gold catching a bid. Markets open in Seoul and Tokyo next. This is Bloomberg. This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. But ahead of that, Paul, we have been unpacking the implications from the U.S. incursion, the arrest of the Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro. For the moment, though, it looks like from futures, there is a bit of that shrugging off in markets in terms of implications. Perhaps the focus is more on AI when it comes to the trade for the first quarter of this year, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely, particularly in the case of Korea. We're just seeing that tech rally rolling on. Markets really shrugging off what happens. The oil price a little bit softer, but it's really a rolling on theme from what we saw at the end of 2025.
Yeah, so let's take a look at how Japan is faring at the start of Monday's session. You are seeing that risk appetite picking back up. The Nikkei, the topics, we are seeing moves upwards of 1%. And even when it comes to those expectations of any element of haven demand for the yen, don't forget we actually saw it at around the 156 handle for much of last week, all of last week, in fact, on dollar yen. But it's that specter of what this Venezuela incursion actually means for investor appetite for U.S. assets and how that is playing out. You can see dollar yen moving up towards the 157 handle, keeping tabs on the yield in Japan as well on the 10-year. You are seeing yields moving upwards. Now, let's talk about South Korea a bit more. To your point about how we are seeing that extension of gains from last week already, those record highs. Some of our guests on the program have already been talking about this IT cycle and how the likes of these chip makers, they still have room to run. South Korean markets, they took a bit of a breather in terms of outperformance towards the later parts of last year. Looks to be clinching that position, and we are seeing the likes of Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, steep moves upwards as well. Paul?
Yeah, let's take a look at how the bond market is tracking after those dramatic events in Venezuela on the weekend. And the short answer is not a huge amount of reaction there. The 2-year barely changed. Similar story for the 10-year as well. Seems the bond market really waiting on this ADP jobs data that we're going to get later this week. There is an expectation 48,000 jobs got added. That's obviously going to have implications for what the Fed does next. It's only a full rate cut priced in until June. So no movement expected in January. So the bond market shrugging off the dramatic capture of Venezuelan President Maduro. The oil price, however, we have seen that move. It's picking up off the floor now, but we did see prices for both crude and Brent softer in the early going. OPEC Plus had a meeting over the weekend as well, reaffirming its plan to leave production unchanged for the first quarter and did not address the issue in Venezuela at all. We're going to address it, though. Let's get to Bloomberg Opinion columnist Juan Pablo Spineto in Buenos Aires. Also with us, Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, who is at the White House. JP, I want to start with you first. I mean, the big question at the moment is who's in charge? I mean, for the moment, it is the Venezuelan vice president who's leading. But how long can we expect that that's going to remain the case? And tell us about the tightrope that she's got to walk in terms of satisfying the Maduro loyalists in her government and the desires of the US.
Yes, exactly. She is in charge now, Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Nicolas Maduro, but we don't know for how long and how sustainable is this situation, because as you said, she now needs to answer to two masters. On one side, the U.S. and Marco Rubio, who has been very clear that they expect her to do exactly what the U.S. want, which is to increase output, to reduce the flow of drugs in the continent. At the same time, she comes from Chavismo, the radical leftist party, which in the last 3 decades opposed the U.S. So we haven't seen so far internal reactions, but this may come out in the next few weeks and months when it's clear what are the exact demands that the White House has put on Delcy Rodriguez and how far she can go. Then we have the issue of the opposition that so far has been sidelined. I think the rationale here has been that they cannot decapitate the whole regime because it will be impossible for anyone to run the country. This is a mid-sized country, the largest, has the largest oil reserves in the world, 30 million people. Obviously, they cannot lift a new government right away, and that's the reason why we see Delcy Rodriguez. But there are a lot of question marks of how far she can go with this agreement.
Tyler, let's bring you in here. We are looking at these, as we've mentioned in the past couple of hours, continued uncertainties about the U.S. approach to all this. How much has this helped to galvanize support from Republican hawks for the Trump administration? And how might that play out perhaps for the midterm elections, which, as we know, is still a while away this year?
They are a while away, but we are in 2026, and I have to tell you, in Washington, it feels like they're a lot closer than they are because the campaign season has really already started to begin. We've really seen a huge outpouring of support on Capitol Hill from Republicans and defense hawks who have broadly applauded President Trump's actions in this case, and it does come at a time where we have seen President Trump's approval ratings dip recently, mostly over domestic issues and not foreign policy issues. So it's been really interesting to watch how this White House really has focused more on foreign policies after what our understanding was going to be a shift to domestic issues and affordability after Republicans lost a series of elections in November. Still, with this is definitely going to serve as a way to galvanize support among Republicans, but we're going to have to see how it actually plays out with voters because, of course, as you well know, President Trump largely campaigned on getting out of foreign entanglements. Still, there are a few different domestic angles here. I'd expect the administration to talk about how this could potentially impact oil prices over the long term. We had heard from the Treasury Secretary a few months ago indicating that once tensions were resolved with Venezuela, that could result in lower oil prices for the American public, though, of course, most analysts say that they're not expecting that to happen anytime soon, since this is going to take a large amount of time to ultimately come to fruition when we're talking about rebuilding that infrastructure and getting investment into the country. So definitely an interesting dynamic to play out. As you're alluding to, campaign season has already started, and this White House had been dealing with a lot of different headwinds, including the healthcare cliff that we just went over when it came to some of those expiring Affordable Care Act premium tax subsidies that had been making the headlines in recent weeks.
What are the challenges here for the Democrats in articulating a position on Venezuela? And also, could we see some movement in the Senate to curb what I guess could be viewed as some executive overreach here when it comes to just removing and extracting the president of a sovereign country?
Well, Paul, what you're alluding to here is this needle that Democrats have been trying to thread in being in support of Nicolas Maduro not being in power, but opposed to how the Trump administration went about the strike. Of course, the U.S. Constitution gives the primary authority to Congress when it comes to military action. And at least through the War Powers Act of 1973, that's curbed the president's power to invoke military action without at least first consulting or notifying Congress. We can confirm, actually, within the last hour, there have been reports that there's going to be a really crucial briefing tomorrow on Capitol Hill with certain select committees of Congress related to foreign affairs and intelligence. That's also going to include what's known as the Gang of Eight. That's the leadership on both sides of the aisle in both chambers, and then the heads of the Senate and House intelligence committees. And this is something that was demanded by lawmakers, considering the administration had confirmed that they did not notify Congress ahead of time. Now, the administration has put forward forward their justification, which includes that they didn't want to see a leak from Congress because they say there was such a large timeline that this mission could have happened under, and they didn't want to risk letting lawmakers know ahead of time and then risk the integrity of the mission. And the second that you're going to hear a lot in the coming days is that the administration is putting forward that they were executing a law enforcement function because Maduro was under indictment, and they say that military action was necessary in order to protect those American lives on the ground that were executing what they say was an arrest warrant. So it's going to be a big conversation on Capitol Hill moving forward, but we'll have to see what sort of levers Congress would be able to pull. There's been some talk on the Hill about some bills going forward that could curb President Trump's power when it comes to acting unilaterally in Venezuela. But at the moment, Republicans control both chambers of Congress, so it is hard to imagine that something could come from it.
JP, one final question to you. When it comes to the reaction that have come out from Venezuelans, it looks pretty mixed. What is your sense of the optimism on the ground that U.S. involvement can help perhaps rebuild some of the oil infrastructure, put Venezuela back on the path for this economic recovery?
No, I think we can say that there has been a massive happiness in the Venezuelans, at least in the Venezuelans outside the country. Let's remember, this is a country that lost 8 million people in the last decades due to Chavismo. So these guys were very happy. I'm actually in Buenos Aires, and there was a rally last night of thousands of Venezuelans gathering in downtown to celebrate the exit of Maduro. But I was talking to some of them, and obviously they are very concerned about what's the future like. I mean, they like to see Maduro gone, but now they have the question marks. Does Rodriguez going to do the same that Maduro was doing? How this is going to be working with the U.S.? So I will say there was a first day of an outbreak of optimism, but now the real questions are starting to kick in.
Thank you to you both, our Bloomberg Opinion columnist Juan Pablo Spinetto in Buenos Aires and Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall at the White House. Now, we are seeing Asia markets for the moment in the early going more or less shrugging off these developments geopolitically. In the Venezuelan and LatAm region. Let's bring in Sean Darby, Managing Director at Mizuho Securities Asia. Sean, we are seeing perhaps the focus for markets, a bit of risk on and the focus on AI. What is that to you? Is there a narrative that is emerging when it comes to what's happened over the weekend? And how would you advocate in terms of positioning?
Good morning and Happy New Year. Well, I think we all were very surprised over the weekend by the news from Venezuela. I think it's actually generally good for risk appetite, mainly because lower oil prices bring down any of the incipient inflation fears, and generally positioning has been very much for global growth to accelerate into 2026, and we don't think the issues in Venezuela are going to disturb that. I think, ironically, that sectors now, like technology, are exhibiting very strong pricing power, possibly the strongest really since COVID, and certainly compared to any period over the last 25 years. That's going to be very, very good news for the heavyweights in Taiwan and Korea. So overall, I don't think positioning is going to be too disrupted by what's happened in Venezuela. And as I said, I think, ironically, it could actually turn out to be very, very good for the backdrop for global equities overall.
The thing markets were kind of wrestling with for much of last year, maybe the back half, was the valuation risk. Has that fear sort of receded a little? How do you see that playing out in the first half?
That's a very good question. So we do start the year with valuations on the higher side, pretty much globally. I think perhaps some of the markets in Latin America and Central Europe actually still look relatively cheap, as they do in China. I think the issues on the valuation will really come down to where bond yields settle. And as you saw at the end of 2025, bond yields from the US to Japan and even in Europe to some extent have now factored in that the rate cutting cycle is almost over. Perhaps the good news is that the short end real rates are actually very close to zero in most of the G7 economies, and that should continue to spur risk appetite. But the really good news is that global growth is actually on a pretty good trend. And I think one thing that we have to sort of look for as an upside surprise is as these tariffs work through the global economy, the manufacturing sector will start to come out of its sort of recession. And certainly that's been seen by some of the orders that we see in the industrial sectors for shipbuilding and aircraft engines. These big, heavyweight, durable goods orders are going to start to play a big role in boosting some of the unloved sectors within the global equity market. So overall, I think you're going to see surprises more now from the manufacturing sector, ex-tech, than you've seen perhaps from services and technology in 2025.
Sean, with Venezuela sucking up all the oxygen in the news agenda, just quietly, the Chinese yuan strengthened through 7 over the past few days. What's that going to mean for Chinese equities, and how much more appreciation do you think there is for the yuan?
It's very much a double-edged sword for the authorities. Clearly, it's going to reinforce the deflationary bias that's been present over the last 24 months. However, it should spur some further policy easing by the PBOC. Remember, PBOC's balance sheet has been expanding since 2020 itself, and it certainly has room to do some more going into 2026. I think the interesting thing is that the equity markets have perceived a very big shift in overall industrial policy in China, one in which is that the authorities are much happier providing subsidies and a boost to the higher value-added areas like IT and also biotech, and have become less worried over the influence of property and some of the old economy areas such as cement and steel. And I think that's going to be very much the picture for 2026 as well. I think that maybe the surprise for Chinese equities in this year is going to be really the attention that's going to be given to the biotech sector. It really has all the hallmarks of the big beneficiaries from AI spending, and also all of this difficulties over the implications from the poor demographics. So there are still some stories out there in China which haven't yet been repriced, and I think the biotech sector is probably one of the most appealing at the moment.
We're seeing energy names doing pretty well across the Asia-Pacific in the early going this morning in the wake of those events in Venezuela. But, of course, China pretty heavily invested in the Venezuelan energy story. What's your outlook for Chinese oil stocks? It could be a choppy few months potentially.
I think that's very much our view as well. I think that overall the global oil market remains well supplied. Potentially there is a peace deal or some ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, which would see potentially lower LNG and gas prices. I think the story in the whole energy complex really is the breakaway between utility prices for electricity, which are being pushed through the global economy now at some of the most fastest paces in history, and the fact that oil prices and energy prices remain low. That divergence between the electricity price and the input prices for energy are going to widen in 2026, and that means the utility sector is going to have a very, very significant outperformance over the energy sector, and I think that's not going to be any different in China either.
Sean, it's been really great to chat. Thank you so much for your insights as we shape up into what could be a really interesting 2026 as well. Sean Darby, Managing Director at Mizuho Securities Asia. Now, we've been keeping tabs, of course, and we'll watch how Chinese energy-related stocks fare when trading begins. But we are looking at moves upwards when it comes to Korea defense-related stocks, given the geopolitical backdrop. Of course, we know how the Trump administration has been advocating for more spending when it comes to sovereign nations on defense. That has been the play for much of last year as well, and looks to be the case this Monday morning. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
There's a quarantine right now in which sanctioned oil shipments, there's a boat, and that boat is under U.S. sanctions. We go get a court order, we will seize it. That remains in place. And that's a tremendous amount of leverage that will continue to be in place until we see changes that not just further the national interest of the United States, which is number one, but also that lead to a better future for the people of Venezuela.
That's Secretary of State Marco Rubio on U.S. plans for Venezuela's oil. Let's take a look at how the oil price is tracking at the moment. And much like many of the other assets that we've looked at today, really starting to now shrug off the dramatic events in Venezuela over the weekend. West Texas off session lows. It's now hovering around 57.38. Of course, Venezuela does supply around 1% of global oil supply. It has huge reserves, but it will be years before any of that additional oil made it to market. Well, President Trump has suggested the US is ready to aid protesters in Iran if authorities crack down on the latest unrest, and that's prompted a top Iranian official to threaten retaliation against US forces in the region. For more, let's get to Bloomberg editor Michael Heath. I mean, Michael, we have seen situations like this in Iran before. Any reason to think that this time is different?
Well, not obviously, Paul. I mean, this sort of kicked off about a week ago when the Iranian currency hit a new low against the US dollar, which in turn affected shops that have been importing goods, etc. Their prices obviously escalated, and they began protesting. Iran's obviously got pretty significant inflation, and you know the whole sanctions thing going on there. So, as you say, we have seen it before. We've seen crackdowns before. Now we had the Ayatollah, the head of state there, basically supreme leader, saying that there's a difference between protests, which were legitimate, you know, that there is a difficult situation, and unrest, you know, riots which have to be combated, kind of thing. So he's trying to draw a distinction there and perhaps give the regime scope to crack down as well, as you mentioned in your intro. But the Iranian opposition is generally very, very divided, and the authorities there have managed to repress this on many occasions. Already we've seen the internet sort of basically closed down so that you can't have groups in various cities communicating with each other and that sort of thing. So they tend to try and pick these groups off. President Trump's intervention, I guess, is the interesting point. Whether, I mean, he's probably got his hands full at the moment, but whether the US actually does decide to do something to aid these protesters, I mean, what that would be, I guess, is really up in the air. But that's perhaps the difference. Whereas before, the world has sort of just looked on and, you know, cheered them on, but not done anything to intervene.
Mike, it's becoming increasingly difficult, I think, to keep tabs on these flashpoints globally. We're also watching developments in Yemen unfold. Are we seeing a sense of perhaps détente or people being brought to the table to bring an end to hostilities?
Yeah, look, Avril, it does seem so. Basically, you had the United Arab Emirates sort of backing a sort of separatist group in southern Yemen there, and then you had the Saudis sort of trying to they're on another side, you know, basically on the government side there. But there is an attempt to try and bring the groups together and bring together some sort of peace talks there as well. I mean, it's such a volatile region, obviously, and you know, it was in the news with the rockets being fired at Israel, you know, during the earlier conflict in Gaza, which is also still bubbling along as well. But yeah, there does seem to be an attempt between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and groups in Yemen to try to find some sort of deal there in you know, a pretty benighted part of the world. So again, look, this has been a long-running conflict. You know, and Iran is involved in there as well. So it just you know, it is just a Gordian knot in a way, that region. But there does seem to be a bit of goodwill working there. I mean, it's fairly early days, so we'll just sort of have to see. But that's the one positive side, I think, Avril. All right, Bloomberg editor Michael Heath. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Now, even as we watch those geopolitical developments unfold between the U.S. and Venezuela, we are seeing Asia markets really shrugging things off. You're looking at a climb of almost 0.8% on the region's benchmark. Of course, with Australia commodities heavy index looking pretty flat. The tech focus indices of Japan, South Korea, those are the ones that are doing really well. And of course, this is the first day back for Japan, and you're seeing these moves on the Nikkei. The climb is, I think, to the highest level since early November and by the most since early December. So we'll see how that continues unfolding, especially given how the investment frenzy over AI, that was certainly a key role in driving Asia stocks and their outperformance for global peers last year. South Korea is also being supported by the chip-related stocks. We're seeing big moves on the likes of SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics. Will continue keeping tabs on that trade for today. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Without the rest of the Chavista regime, the rest of the Maduro regime staying in power, without changes to the corrupt system that has led to so much of the deterioration in the oil sector, in the rest of the economy, if none of that changes, I wouldn't expect to see any meaningful changes in Venezuela.
In fact, I think some of the lessons that we have learned from past nation-building exercises is as long as stability on the ground exists from local forces, there is no need for United States military forces.
So I think in the short term, what we're likely to see is supply disruptions in Venezuela. And in the long term, we could see additional barrels of oil from Venezuela in the long term. I don't think that this is a matter of 1-2 years. I think we're talking about 5 to 8 years.
There's Bloomberg TV guests reacting to Maduro's ouster. And let's take a look at how some of these risk assets are tracking. Oil prices bouncing back off lows now. I mean, as some of those guests were pointing out, Venezuela contributes a vanishingly small amount of global supply. And even though it has the largest reserves in the world, developing those reserves is going to take a long, long time. Gold prices, meanwhile, just resuming their upward climb following on from the stellar gains we saw in 2025. Well, having deposed Nicolas Maduro, President Trump says he has big plans for Venezuela's oil industry and its vast reserves. Bloomberg Originals has been taking a look at Trump's possible goals for the country's oil resources.
The U.S. has carried out a series of airstrikes in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
President Donald Trump has said his threats against Venezuela, the U.S. military buildup in the region, and the destruction of civilian boats are about alleged drug trafficking. But there's another issue Trump has been talking about.
The oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Venezuela, on paper, has more than 300 billion barrels of oil.
Or roughly 17% of the world's known oil reserves.
Most of those reserves are in this vast deposit known as the Orinoco Oil Belt.
But there's even more potential underground.
The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that Venezuela has more than 1 trillion barrels of oil in place in the Orinoco Belt. To put it in perspective, the world until today has consumed about 1.5 trillion.
The chances are they are going to outlast the world's demand for oil, so effectively they are limitless at this point.
And there already is a U.S. oil company that's been operating in the country for decades.
Chevron produces about 25% of Venezuela's oil today, is the largest investor in the oil industry and in the country.
We are going to run the country until such time as a proper transition can take place.
And subscribers can watch more Bloomberg Originals reports on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Well, joining us now is Jason Schenker, President and Chief Economist at Prestige Economics. Jason, thanks so much for joining us today. And as we're seeing in the early going in trade in Asia this Monday morning, markets really shrugging off those spectacular events in Venezuela. How's your risk appetite this morning? Any change?
Well, not really. This is something that is part of, I think, the geopolitical tensions I've seen rising over the last few years. Cold War II is a book that I had out, international bestseller early last year, talked about these risks, talked about including Venezuela as a potential source of proxy war risk in Latin America because of its closeness to Beijing and Moscow. And that, I think, is one of the key factors here. If you look, a lot of what's going on is just a continuation from the U.S. national security strategy and the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as well as the other accelerations and tensions we've seen globally in just the last couple of weeks following the National Defense Authorization Act, with funding allocated for aid to Taiwan, as well as for a military drill, a large-scale drill based on mobilization assessment and sustainability for U.S. action in the Indo-Pacific region, and then follow that by Chinese military actions, the Justice Mission 2025, in which joint forces surrounded Taiwan, including the Chinese Coast Guard, as a temporary blockade, right? This kind of action is something that we see the Venezuela story, part of rooting out the influences of Moscow and Beijing in the Western Hemisphere. Those tensions are likely to persist on a global basis.
Yeah, and if we zoom out from all of this and set aside all the drama, the fundamentals remain the same. I mean, we have a chart here on the Bloomberg terminal which illustrates, oil prices with that market in oversupply and approaching a glut, and at the same time, gold just dramatically outperforming it. Is this a trend you see continuing throughout this year?
Gold prices, precious metals in general, do see significant upside risk because global geopolitical tensions show no sign of easing. We see a risk of an acceleration going forward. As for things like oil, there is upside for oil prices later in the year because there's upside potential for global growth with lower interest rates globally, in addition to the weaker dollar. I'm forecasting a somewhat weakness through the first half of the year in the greenback based on expectations of further Fed cuts, but then there could be some bounce back in the dollar in the second half of the year as growth improves further and the U.S. labor market sees some upside. What all of that means is that industrial metals demand could see upside in the second half of the year, but could also rise in the first half as well. The growth prospects globally are increasing and improving, and of course, while we don't want to think about moving to military readiness and economic mobilization for wartime readiness as a means of conflict deterrence, we see it in the United States, in Japan, in Europe. There's increases in defense spending, which will support growth, but will also impact currency markets and will drive up demand for industrial metals. All of those trends seem likely to continue in 2026, especially because there is widespread awareness and belief that 2027 is the year that Premier Xi has said he wants China to be ready to be able to take control of Taiwan. Well, 2027 is less than a year away now, and if the United States and other countries, including Japan, Australia, and other allies, want to deter that kind of conflict, they have to project readiness. And I think a lot of what happened in Venezuela was a demonstration of power, also to be seen through the eyes of Moscow and Beijing and their would-be allies, in the same way that the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities by the United States was also done for Beijing and Moscow to see it and to be aware of what the risks are in the event of a larger conflict over, say, Taiwan.
To your point about some of the beneficiaries from U.S. policy, it sounds like defense could be one of the sectors. You also look at how IT or AI-related industries have performed in the past year. What is that going to mean for the U.S. economy for this year, and how uneven do you think the growth is going to look like?
I think there's going to be more opportunities in AI and technology. I think the technological iron curtain between the United States and its allies and China and its allies, that's going to fall more fully this year. You're going to see dual-use technology supply chains further cleave. You will see those bifurcations. I think that supply chain is going to become more critical. I think industrial production, heavy industry, manufacturing, material, dual-use technology, all of those are going to be sectors for big opportunities in the year ahead. And of course, if you realize that global supply chains are splitting and there is a preparation for a risk of economic amputation of China from the global economy, the way that happened to Russia when it invaded Ukraine, that risk is going to drive investments in supply chains so that manufacturers and businesses are secure, even in the event of full economic amputation from China.
You're alluding to some of this, perhaps rethink that has already been underway last year, the continuation you speak of on U.S. assets. What is your sense of how that unfolds for the dollar, especially against the backdrop of a yuan that has been resurging?
I think that for the dollar, there's been significant downside this year, which has been a benefit to the U.S. That is a detriment to China. A weaker currency and lower interest rates favor a country trying to wean itself off of Chinese imports. And so that weaker dollar we've seen throughout the past year, we can see a little further weakness. Those are things that disadvantage Chinese exports into the United States, and those are things that advantage American domestic manufacturing. So I think you're going to see a little bit more dollar weakness here. The People's Bank of China may take action this year to try to weaken their currency. We'll see how that goes. But there are risks to Chinese exports and the Chinese economy if we continue to see that pressure, and if we see pressure rising from Europe as well, where we now see a lot of goods that would have otherwise come to the U.S. going into Europe. You're going to see some pushback there as well, because we're in Cold War II, and the collaboration between China and Russia and their allies is so strong, and Europe is probably going to push back on that as well. We're probably going to see those pressures result in further a redirection of investment and production. We could see China remain a very risky place for Americans to invest and for others. And it may be that Americans view China increasingly as a great place to send your money if you never want to see it again, because that's what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. Those risks could increase.
Jason, I just want to finish with a bit of a bread and butter question, really. We've got a Fed meeting coming up later this month. I mean, the bond market's pretty much shaken off the events in Venezuela over the weekend. Seems to be looking ahead to the ADP jobs numbers we get later this week. What are your expectations around job market strength or otherwise in the US? And what do you think we'll see this year in terms of Fed easing?
I think we're going to see 2 Fed rate cuts this year. Last year I expected 3, and that was out of consensus. We got 3. This year I expect 2. I know that's a little out of consensus as well. Most are expecting 1. I think we're probably going to get our first one in March. I don't expect a rate cut here in January. For the next jobs report and CPI report, I think the CPI, both year on year and core CPI, are going to bounce back a little bit, jump up to 2.9% year on year from the lower numbers we saw in the November report. For December jobs report, I think the unemployment rate is going to come down to 4.5% from 4.6. Payrolls be modestly positive. For the full year, I think the unemployment rate will be higher than last year, and I think the total CPI and core CPI will be average this year, lower than in 2025, allowing the Fed to cut twice.
Jason, thank you very much for giving us this food for thought for the year ahead. Jason Schenker is president and chief economist at Prestige Economics. Now, we also have some breaking news hearing from the U.S. president as he has been speaking on Air Force One, and he's talking about how he has been speaking to the service members in the operation related to the capturing of the Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro. Of course, we also have these live pictures to bring you. Let's take a look. We are seeing, of course, you're looking at those live pictures out of Washington and listening in. Take a listen.
You can't do that. You can't do that with me. They did it with other presidents.
How soon do you think an election can take place in Venezuela? How soon can an election take place?
Well, I think we're looking more at getting it fixed, getting it ready first, because it's a mess. The country is a mess. It's been horribly run. The oil is just flowing at a very low level, much lower than, even if it was badly run, it should have more income, more oil than what they're doing. So we're going to have the big oil companies go in, and they're going to fix the infrastructure, and they're going to invest money. We're not going to invest anything. We're going to just take care of the country. We're going to cherish the country. We're going to take care, more importantly, of the people, including Venezuelans that are living in our country that were forced to leave their country. And they're going to be taken very good care of. Yes, ma'am.
Have you spoken with the oil companies about going into Venezuela? Have you received any commitments? Any commitments from the oil companies?
They want to go in so badly.
Did you speak with them before the operation took place about, did you maybe tip them off about what was coming?
And they want to go in. And they're going to do a great job for the people of Venezuela. And they're going to represent us well. But, you know, the infrastructure is rusty, rotten, most of it unusable. It's old, it's broken. You see pipes laying all over the ground. Nothing's been invested for years. Chevron's in, as you know, they've done a good job, but even they haven't been in a position to invest money because they're at a month-to-month basis.
What happened, Mr. President?
They're only there because I wanted them to be there.
Contingencies in case the military in Venezuela is unhappy with the U.S. and the way it's running Venezuela? Do you guys have plans for anything?
So Venezuela thus far has been very nice, but it helps to have a force like we have. You know, we were ready for a second wave. We were all set to go, but we don't think we're going to need it.
There's about $17 billion worth of oil reserves in Venezuela. Is that going to be...
You mean trillion?
And is that going to be something...
You say billion or trillion?
I said billion.
You said 17 billion? It's much more than that.
Okay, so what is going to happen to those reserves?
Well, we're going to run everything. We're going to run it, fix it. We'll have elections at the right time. But the main thing you have to fix, it's a broken country. There's no money. There's inflation. Like we would have had, if I didn't win this election, we would have been Venezuela on steroids. Lindsay would know that. You might say something on that because we were talking before. We would have had a doubling up of very bad things that cost us a lot of money, like welfare, frankly. We wouldn't have had jobs. And instead of having $18 trillion in, we would have had at least $5 to $10 trillion leaving the country. So our costs would have gone up, and all of the money that's, you know, we're setting a record. It's long broken. And that's it. That's after 10 months. We haven't included the 11th month yet. So we think we're going to hit over $20 trillion. The all-time record is 3 by another country known as China. About 10 years ago, they did 3. We're going to do close to 20 trillion. By the way, there has never been anything like this ever before. And it's all because of tariffs and the election, but it's because of tariffs.
There was a time.
Without tariffs, we wouldn't have 10 cents being invested.
There was a time back in 2016, I remember your RNC speech, and you were saying that regime change and nation building.
Where?
When you were speaking at the RNC back in 2016, you were criticizing regime change and nation building, the U.S. being involved in that. It seems obviously that your stance has changed on that. What led to that? And is the U.S. nation building now? Is that
this isn't a country that's on the other side of the world. This isn't a country like where you have to travel 24 hours in an airplane. This is Venezuela. It's in our area. The Don Road Doctrine.
So is that what you would say, that we're in the business of nation building now?
We're in the business of having countries around us that are viable and successful, and where the oil is allowed to freely come out, because that's good. It gets the prices down. That's good for our country. Now, we have a very sick neighbor. It's not a neighbor, but it's close to a neighbor, and that's Venezuela. It's very sick. Colombia is very sick, too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, and he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you.
What does that mean? He's not going to be doing it very long.
He's not doing it very long. He has cocaine mills and cocaine factories. He's not going to be doing it very long.
So there will be an operation by the U.S. and
It sounds
Colombia?
good to me.
Secretary Rubio mentioned Cuba yesterday.
They kill a lot of people, yeah.
Secretary Rubio mentioned Cuba yesterday in his remarks. Does the U.S. have a plan to do similar action in Cuba?
Survive because of Venezuela. Now they won't have that money coming in. They won't have the income coming in. You know, a lot of Cubans were killed yesterday. You know that. A lot of Cubans were killed.
Do you know how many? Does the administration know?
But there was a lot of death on the other side. No death on our side. But there was a lot of death on the other side, unfortunately. But a lot of Cubans were killed yesterday, trying to protect him.
There's been protesters killed in Iran. You said we were locked and loaded, ready to go. What is the line there for when the U.S. is going to get involved in those protests?
We'll take a look. We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
Can I add something? So when he first got elected in January, we met, biggest comeback ever. We talked about
so really? I didn't feel it was a comeback, actually.
So
because the first one was
the bottom line is we talked about a drug caliphate in our backyard. We had Venezuela, we have Cuba, we have Colombia in our backyard, and these three countries have been condemned ever since I've been in politics. Joe Biden put a $25 billion bounty on Maduro's head. Chris Smith, the day he got inaugurated, said, I hope Trump will hold Maduro's feet to the fire. You did. So what has he done? He's going to clear our backyard of a drug caliphate, countries run by narco-terrorist dictators who murder, rape, send drugs into our country to kill thousands of our citizens. To my Democratic friends, you should be celebrating this. When bin Laden went down, I was the first to applaud President Obama. This was one of the most sophisticated military operations in the history of the country. What they were able to do was amazing. They knew we were coming. We had a good part of the Navy, and they were able to capture this man alive. No military in the world could have done it. And as to this commander-in-chief, he did something people talked about doing. You just wait for Cuba. Cuba is a communist dictatorship that's killed priests and nuns. They've preyed on their own people. Their days are numbered. We're going to wake up one day, I hope in 26, in our backyard, we're going to have allies in these countries doing business with America, not narco-terrorist dictators killing Americans. This is a big frigging day. And everybody in the world is thinking differently than they were just a few days ago because of what you did.
By the way, you mentioned something that's interesting. Lindsay mentioned bin Laden. I wrote about bin Laden 1 year before the attack on the World Trade Center. And I said, you got to go after bin Laden. It was in my book. And very few people want to say that, but it was in my book. You know that, I think. You've actually talked about it. But if they would have listened to me, they would have taken out bin Laden, and you wouldn't have had the World Trade Center tragedy.
Yeah, this is certainly going.
Did you know that? I predicted bin Laden.
I learned something every day.
No, but did you hear that?
I didn't know. I just heard it right now.
No, I wrote a book. It was 1 year before the attack that the book came out, and it talked about, there's a whole page, a whole section dedicated to a guy named bin Laden who's a bad guy who you have to take out.
So I'll get the book. But right after the election, he told me, I'm going to clean up our backyard. Now, this was before he took office. This is one of the president's priorities, is to make sure that people in our backyard, narco-terrorist states, will not continue to kill Americans without the number of people that will be alive today because Venezuela will be in different hands. It's going to be tens of thousands. This is something to be celebrated, whether you like him or not.
Not just Venezuela. It's what's coming out of Venezuela in the form of ocean-going and Gulf-going and sea-going boats. Every time we knock out a boat, and we've done a lot of them, we did 3 over the last few days, they're very rare now. You don't see too many of them. But drugs by sea are down 97%. Think of that. Now we're going to stop them by land, too. The land is easy. We had to do the sea before we did the land because it just works out.
Yeah, you were just talking about the land, but it sounded like you weighed out.
And by the way, you have to do something with Mexico. Mexico has to get their act together because they're pouring through Mexico, and we're going to have to do something. We'd love Mexico to do it. They're capable of doing it. But unfortunately, the cartels are very strong in Mexico.
I remember one time you actually, speaking of Mexico, I asked you about Claudia Sheinbaum, and you told me at one point you had offered to send U.S. troops into Mexico to combat drug trafficking there. Is that something you have spoken to her about?
I think she's a terrific person. I would say every single time I talk to her, I offered to send troops.
And she's just not willing?
She's concerned. She's a little afraid. The cartels are running Mexico. Whether you like it or not, it's not nice to say, but the cartels are running Mexico.
Speaking of those U.S. troops, I mean, one thing that Americans and a lot of people are wondering, you just sounded like you weighed out another strike, another land strike at least in Venezuela. You sound like you weighed that out. But
well, we didn't need it. We were prepared to do a second strike if we needed it. We're totally prepared.
But that's off the table.
We're still prepared.
That's off the table now.
No, it's not. If they don't behave, we will do a second strike.
Will you demand that the
the American troops, are they going to be on the ground? They're doing any kind of peacekeeping? I think Americans are very...
It depends on what happens. It depends a little bit on the new administration, if you want to call it.
So if you see that pushback from Rodriguez and ultimately...
Well, I don't think there was pushback. I think that...
She called it...
You hear a different person than I hear.
Really? So you have spoken with her?
We talked to them, yeah.
Oh, you did speak with her?
They've been very good.
Because she called it kidnapping of Maduro.
It's all right. It's not a bad term. Go ahead.
No, are you going to demand that Delcy Rodriguez...
Hearing that from the U.S. president taking reporter questions aboard Air Force One following developments over the weekend with Venezuela, pointing to a range of sovereign nations mentioned, including Colombia, Mexico, Cuba as well. Something we're going to be continuing to watch in the session today, although stocks are pretty much shrugging things off. This is Bloomberg.